An ex-Minnesota police officer is now facing second-degree manslaughter charges for shooting and killing 20-year-old Daunte Wright during a traffic stop in Brooklyn Center, just 20 minutes outside of Minneapolis, where George Floyd was killed less than a year ago. Kim Potter, the Brooklyn Center cop, resigned from the department yesterday along with the city's chief of police. Potter and her partner had been attempting to arrest Wright over an outstanding warrant that came up after they stopped him for a minor traffic violation. When he turned, got back in his car, she then warned Wright that she would tase him, but instead fired a bullet into his chest, killing him. Potter, a 26-year veteran of the force, has said the shooting was an accident and that she intended to use her taser instead. Protesters have taken to the streets in the days since in Minnesota and beyond, expressing their outrage over yet another black man killed by police, all while another ex-Minnesota officer is still on trial. In the 11th hour, Derek Chauvin has been bringing on witnesses willing to defend his actions, including a former medical examiner with a history of blaming black people killed by police for their own deaths. Former Maryland Chief Medical Examiner David Fowler, who's currently being sued for his ruling in a similar police killing in 2018, testified today that Floyd's death was caused by drug use and prior medical conditions, despite a very clear verdict confirmed last week by the ME who actually worked on the case.
The law enforcement subdual, restraint, and the neck compression was just more than Mr. Floyd could take. I would still classify it as a homicide today.
Joining me to discuss the relationship with police and those they're charged with protecting are Michael Curry, former president of the Boston NAACP, now chair of the National NAACP Advocacy and Policy Committee, Natashia Tidwell, former federal prosecutor and police officer who served as a sergeant detective in the Cambridge Police Department's Internal Affairs Division. She later reviewed Boston Police Department internal affairs investigations as a member of the city's Community Ombudsman Oversight Panel. And Jamarhl Crawford, community activist, editor of Blackstonian, and a member of the Boston Police Reform Task Force. Welcome to all three of you. Thank you very much for giving me your time. If I may, I'd like to ask all three of you the same question to start this off. Starting with you, Natashia, does a guilty verdict in the Chauvin murder trial change anything, or does it simply provide a measure of justice for the murder of George Floyd?
Wow. Well, being the eternal pessimist that I am, I don't want to sort of jinx myself to think that we're heading towards a guilty verdict. I certainly think that a guilty verdict would be just here. I'm not sure that it changes anything, and it saddens me to say that. But I think that you can. This case is almost, if they can't convict here, then they'll never convict, right? And so I view a potential conviction here to mean that things are changing, because I think we view, while the trial is going on just down the street, we've got these other things. We've got the issue or the situation in Virginia with the military officers. So I'm not sure that a guilty verdict here would change things. I think that, if we can't do it here, I think it sort of cements that we may never be able to get a guilty verdict.
Jamarhl, would it change anything, a guilty verdict, that is?
Well, while we certainly all want a guilty verdict, and that would certainly be just, it could be a step in the right direction, a drop in the bucket, but no, it is certainly not justice in and of itself. Malcolm X, famously said, if you stab me and you put the knife 9 inches in my back and you pull it out 1 inch, some may call that progress or what have you, but we have to look at this thing where this is a guilty verdict here would be the right thing for this, but no, it does not speak to the 100 or 1,000 other times where we have experienced injustice or no justice at all.
Michael, are you a dissenter or are you in agreement with your two colleagues?
An agreement, maybe a little bit of a disagreement in that I think, one, first and foremost, that the family wants this outcome, right? So does it make a difference? I think the family will never get George Floyd back. They've said that. But what they do want is they want a just outcome, as both of the other guests have said. I think that makes a difference. We have a system that is not trustworthy. That's why people don't trust the outcome. In order to start gaining that trust, we need to have a victory. We need to know that the officer in this case, Derek Chauvin, is being held accountable. it'll be many years and many other verdicts before we get to a place. But this is that drop in the bucket we need to know that the system is trying to regain our confidence or gain our confidence, because we've never had confidence in the system.
You know, Jamarhl, Michael just used the term victory. Let's assume there's one victory in this, in the Chauvin case. My analysis, if I step back, is it's one step forward and 10 steps back. In just the past couple of days, while this has all been going on, right back here at home, we find out in the Boston Globe that a cop who was a likely child molester was allowed to continue molesting or whatever else he did for 2 decades, covered up by somebody in high places in the police force. Go down to New Bedford, 7% of the population is black. We learned in a report today, 46% of the stops and frisks by police are black. So are we making progress overall, or are we just talking a really good game?
No, and Jim, this is what a person such as me, you know, who's been advocating about these things for years, it's like, you know, you're screaming in the desert, you're telling these people things that you might as well be talking about UFO and Sasquatches. Nobody believes you until these things hit the newspaper and it's verified by court cases, multiple sources. Up until that point, for instance, Mr. Curry, when he was the president of the Boston NAACP, I can guarantee you hundreds of phone calls with people who had every manner. Ms. Tidwell, who when she was on the co-op, every manner of case that comes before folks, but it's only a small segment that get any bit of attention at all. And even in those, we really don't get a semblance of justice. And particularly here in Boston as the city and Massachusetts as the state, we skate on a lot of stuff because we're so perfect, we're so smart, we're so cute. And we escape on all of the stuff that other places get a bad rap for, L.A., Alabama, Mississippi, Chicago. And somehow Boston is the darling child, but yet I would say that we are not only a case in point of white supremacy and racism, particularly when it comes in relation to policing, but we are the epicenter. This is ground zero. This is the first police force in the nation.
Michael, you agree with that?
Absolutely. I think, you know, the thing that I'm most looking forward to is the truth. We've not had a truth about policing in this country. We've not had a truth about policing in Boston. It's interesting that we often lift up, and Jamarhl, quite frankly, has been the leader on really lifting up these cases historically in Boston before most people knew about them. So I think we have a challenge that comes before you really change policies. You have to have a reckoning around what happened. How did we get here? And I don't think we as a city have been ready to have that kind of a conversation. I hope that with the work of the Boston NAACP, Tanisha Sullivan, with the work of many other activists, Jamarhl, Ms. Tidwell, that we're at this place where we can first deal with the truth and then really start changing culture and policy to follow.
Well, I don't want to be the optimistic note here, and maybe I shouldn't be, but Natashia, I want to play for you something Acting Mayor Janey said yesterday when she was speaking of police accountability in the city. Here she is.
I understand that the fabric of trust between the Boston Police Department and Boston residents has worn thin in parts of our city, especially in communities of color. We must prioritize transparency and accountability. These are foundational values when it comes to fostering public trust. That is why my administration is doubling down on our work to stand up the Boston Office of Police Accountability and Transparency.
And one of the things that office is going to look at, Natashia, something you know a lot about, internal affairs, and why, for example, until Janey announced yesterday, there was no release of information about an apparent cover-up of the situation with this Patrick Rose, an abuser decades ago and allegedly an abuser much more recently, refusal still to disclose what happened with our commissioner for a day, Dennis White, refusal to disclose those internal affairs things. Is what Janey was describing as accountability yesterday, is that a step in the right direction?
Absolutely it is. I think that, you know, accountability and transparency go hand in hand. If you want to get the trust of the people who are being policed, you have to sort of show your cards, and you have to be willing to trust them with information if you want them to trust you in return. And I think, you know, the reflex has been to shield internal affairs records, to shield, under sort of nuanced or, manipulating sort of pretzel type logic as to how it falls within the public records law or doesn't. And I think that Acting Mayor Janney took a huge step forward by saying that the reflex should be to reveal this information and then to sort of say, okay, well, what do we need to redact to protect the names of domestic violence victims or sexual assault victims, to let that be sort of what follows. But the reflex can't be to throw up the shield automatically.
Well, Natashia, just staying on this for a second, explain to me why the default shouldn't always be to make such investigations, internal affairs investigations, public, and only if there's a good reason not to, that's affirmed by some independent authority. Why shouldn't the default be transparency?
Well, the default is under the law, right? So the public records law doesn't exempt these from release. It has all of the other the reasons, the things that need to be redacted. But the default is you give it up unless there's reason not to, or you have things within the public records law to redact. But police departments historically have sort of operated under these notion that the public can't be trusted with this information, or that the officers have these privacy rights that don't extend, that aren't justifiable under the public records law. But if you want the community to trust you, then you have to sort of trust the community to be able to handle this information, and that just hasn't been the operating sort of philosophy for police departments for quite some time, I think ever.
Jamarhl, you were on the task force, the city task force that created this office that Janney announced the director of yesterday. Are you satisfied?
I probably will never be satisfied. But
you're satisfied with this?
Well, I mean, this is definitely a step in the right direction for sure. And I would say that how I and others came to the conclusion of this was informed a lot by the previous work of the co-op, both the iteration that Ms. Tidwell served on and the very first iteration, which every report of the co-op basically echoed the same sentiments. And so when we came up with what kind of entity could we create that would answer a lot of the questions that the community had been posing, all the reports had already indicated, all the other panels that did, this is what we came up with. So this is the best thing we got, but no, it's not over. This is just the beginning.
Michael, today, this Kristen Clark, who, if confirmed, will be head of the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice, she had the audacity to say we must invest less in police and more in social workers. Obviously, a lot of Republicans on that committee weren't happy with that. Apparently, she is charged, if confirmed, by the boss, Joe Biden, to look into a lot of the issues we've talked about. I see that as a positive step. But in 30 seconds each, if I can, starting with you, Michael, what would make a difference? What's the most important undone thing on this police front that would change the dynamic in this country? Starting with you, Michael, quickly, if we can.
Yeah, I think, we've made progress here in the state legislature, not enough, and credit to all those activists. But there's also the George Floyd Justice and Policing Bill. Some version of that needs to be passed, even if it's through reconciliation. It needs to get done under the Biden administration. We have to do, and I'm always a fan of Rachel Rollins here as a DA in Massachusetts. We need that kind of disruptive leadership, because going against unions, police unions, is going to cause a backlash. And we need that kind of leadership coming out of Washington, coming out of the state legislature, and frankly, coming out of City Hall as well.
Jamarhl, take 30 seconds. What reform, single reform, could change the dynamic?
Well, I can't do a single, but I'm going to say we definitely need to figure a way to destabilize the power of the unions. Never before have so few wielded the power that has the influence over so many. And then also, too, we need to get into the economics of it, where people have talked about qualified immunity and things like now with the case of Patrick Rose. So does this guy, he gets to keep his pension? I'm not comfortable with that. We need to examine pensions for people who had bad misbehavior in the past.
I am so with you on that. And finally, Natashia Tidwell, what would you do?
Well, I don't want to echo or sort of repeat what my colleagues have said, but so I will just add the civil service system here in Massachusetts, which sort of has a stranglehold on not only recruitment and sort of who gets hired, but also the ability of the police departments to discipline and to fire when police departments do want to hold officers accountable. The civil service system makes it very difficult for those decisions to hold. So that would be the thing that I would point to here.
And Jim, veterans preference is another one of those. The veterans preference, which pipelines white males into positions in law enforcement.
Michael Curry, Jamarhl Crawford, Natashia Tidwell, I really appreciate your time and your thoughts. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Jim.
Thanks for having us.